For Creamer Media's Polity, I'm Shannon de Ryhove. Political analyst Ebrahim Fakir joins me in studio to discuss political party funding. Welcome, Ebrahim.
Hi.
Lack of transparency and regulation in party funding poses a threat to democracy in South Africa. Why is this the case?
I'm not sure that it's just democracy that is affected. Our entire system of public values are in fact subverted. So in a democratic sense, it does mean that the equality of the vote doesn't really count that much. And what really might count, especially where we don't know who's funding who and to what extent they might in fact be influencing those people that they fund, especially governing parties. Parties who are in government, who receive large amounts of donations and funding from private sources which no one knows about. It's very opaque to know what level of influence is being exercised on them. So that's the first sin. The second is that when you have no disclosure, you don't know who is giving which party what money and for what purpose. And so it detracts completely from the values of transparency. We've already made the case that really this does subtracts from equality. And of course it leads to high levels of public corruption because one is not entirely sure who's giving what to who, on what basis. We also, given that parties now have investment vehicles, what deals are being struck on a basis of insider trading where people know what contracts are going to come up when they award contracts and tenders on the basis of having kickbacks which flow back to the political party. So there are very good reasons why you want to have party funding, or at least a regulation of party funding to a certain extent. The regulation, however, has to be very discreet because the regulation can give rise to a series of unintended consequences. It can, for instance, drive funding underground. It can provide a dampener in the most obvious sense, where people might feel afraid to be identified when there's disclosure to be giving money to certain political parties. Or people might feel, if I give to one of the opposition parties, it's likely that a party in government who I may not have given any money to won't give me a tender or won't award me work or won't give me a contract. So, there's obvious unintended consequences and then there are subterranean unintended consequences. For instance, driving the stuff underground, which gives rise to criminal networks in some cases, or siphoning money off through regular transactions and contracts, but going off towards a party. So, there are those issues which do arise, and how you regulate does in fact matter.
Now, there are also suggestions that there must be greater involvement of the public in democracy, but wouldn't that mean that people would be forced to make political contributions or money to these political parties that they don't support?
Obviously, what you're talking about is public funding, increasing the size of public money which is available, and that public money obviously comes from the fiscus, which comes from taxpayers. And so the argument you're making is that taxpayers would effectively be giving monies to parties that they don't in fact want. I don't fully buy that argument, and I don't buy that argument because I think all citizens have an interest in how well or how badly a democracy is going to function and how well a party in government is able to perform. At the same time, they also have it in their interest to ensure that parties in opposition have sufficient resources to be able to organize, mobilize, and play an effective opposition role, to articulate interests, to aggregate those interests however they might be. So all citizens have an interest in how well or how badly their parties function, how efficiently, how effectively. And so a system of public funding is in fact a good one. And I think there's good reason why many jurisdictions have a public funding. Now, of course, in South Africa we have public funding. You can quibble at the formula, and I think admittedly the formula is quite skewed and is quite bad because 90% of a total pot of money which may be available, 90% of this pot goes to parties proportionately and 10% goes to them equitably. Now, of course, that obviously means that the parties which have a higher proportion of the votes continue to cash in a larger number of money. And in a system where you've got a large amount of identity voting going on and you've got an overwhelming and overweening majority party, they consistently cash in on the largest amounts of money, and so smaller entrants to the market are prejudiced. They don't have enough resources to be able to organize and fulfill their party functions, to administer themselves, to manage themselves properly, to in fact do serious policy work. So they're constrained in that sense. So of course that formula may need to be revised, but I'm not sure that increasing public funding will automatically make citizens feel that they are having to contribute to something that they don't agree with, or that that public funding itself will automatically address many of the problems that parties have. I mean, parties have other endemic serious problems, but funding, if we have greater amount of public funding, it can only be a good thing. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't have private funding. I think we should have private funding because parties in reality need money, and I think corporate citizens and ordinary citizens should, in a democracy, feel free to be able to support a party that they like, specifically so that they are more effective and more efficient and manage themselves well, they run well, they administer themselves well, they do serious policy work, they do serious outreach, engagement, communications, etc. So, I think citizens have it in their interest to pay for this. The extent to which they do, of course, is a different matter. Now, if you increase the size of public funding, that's a good thing. But in South Africa, I think we'll have to look at the way in which the proportions are being distributed, because at the moment there's a manifest inequality and inequity in the way in which this is done. So one can play around with the formula and increase the size of funding. That will go some way in alleviating some of the problems. But at the same time, just increasing the size of public funding doesn't mean that you shouldn't have regulation of private funding. You should have both. Increase the size of public funding, but at the same time put in a regulatory framework which will look at issues of disclosure, or at least some level of disclosure of private funding. And there are many options available here. On the one hand, you could say you would want disclosure above a certain amount. The problem with the threshold is that you could have someone who could come in just under the threshold and say, well, we'll give 99,000 rather than 100,000.
And we'll give it in 2 tranches or something.
Yeah, or 3 or 4, however many, and they don't have to disclose. So, you would have to then create the threshold to be a per annum figure for how much you get. So those are regulatory questions which, of course, you can sort out when you put this thing in place. In principle, I think we need to agree that we need some regulation of private funding, and we need to increase the size of public funding.
Now, the ANC resolved to discuss political party funding at its 52nd National Conference in Polokwane. There were some specific proposals made, part of it that taxpayers support democracy, effectively proposing a greater amount of public funding, as you've said. Will it work?
Well,
don't you think that current public funding is skewed enough?
Well, I mean, yes, we've said the proportions are a little skewed, they're inequitable, they're unequal, and of course we need to look at that system. But that doesn't rule out the fact that you should have increased the size of public funding. Of course we can discuss and talk about what the regulatory measures should be in revising the formula and distributing it differently. But the principle that there ought to be a pot of public money from which parties will get some amounts in order to run themselves, I think is a good thing. Now, in a way, we've had a little bit of this, because what has happened is that you've had 2 or 3 corporates giving money to the Independent Electoral Commission and saying, look, this is what we would like you to do with this money. You can use some of it to administer yourself, which and that's a good thing too, because it means that South Africa runs its own elections, we pay for it, we protect our sovereignty in that way, and our corporate citizens are coming to the party by saying we support this democracy. At the same time, some of them have also said we will give this amount of money to these parties, so they voluntarily disclosed where they would go. Now, the ANC's proposals, some of them have not been spelled out, but they've made an in-principle suggestion that they want to look at the question of party funding and the regulation of private funding in particular, and have made some proposals in that regard. None of them very concrete, but it's something that they will come back to. Incidentally, all of our parties were not big fans of disclosure, especially around private funding, and institutions like IDASA which ran both a court case and a long-running campaign to have some disclosure, were met, in fact, in the courts with not only resistance from the political parties, but the courts saying, look, this is in fact a regulatory and a legal question which if you want change must happen through Parliament. We're not going to suggest that this ought to happen. Now, the fact that the ANC is making this proposal is a good thing. That they will discuss it, of course, is also a good thing. That they haven't discussed it is not such a good thing, or at least in detail. And perhaps that's where we need to look at going from now. Specific and concrete proposals around what the ANC would like to do. There are some on the table. One is increasing the size of public funding, yes. At the same time, this will give rise to a debate about changing the formula, and I think the formula ought to be revised, to be made more equal, more equitable. We can keep the principle of proportionality because that's fair, but it's manifestly unfair that some of the parties, the smaller parties outside the big one, share only 10% on an equitable basis. So I think that one doesn't make too much sense. Will we have complete disclosure? That's a difficult question, especially of private funding. Now, does the ANC want to impose caps on how much parties can receive? Well, there are some places in which they have caps on how much parties can receive per year. And they have to disclose at the same time. The problem with caps is that you are in fact prejudicing someone by saying to them and curtailing their freedom by saying to them, sorry, you can only give X amount per year to the party of your choice. So, I think the caps have a problem. There's a way around it by saying, well, you can give how much you want to parties, but parties can only spend X amount, especially on campaign funding, on campaign finance, or campaign spending. So there are caps on how much you can use to campaign, but you can use other money to do other things, like policy formulation and development, communications and outreach. That's a form of campaigning, yes, but it's not specifically around elections, etc. But that's part of routine or parties' routine outreach work. So they could use those monies for those purposes, but you can say you can only spend this much on campaigning, or especially at election time, and that would form part of a code of conduct and probably find its way into a party law, etc. So that's the one option. And the other option, which I'm not a fan of, as I stated earlier, is to place caps on how much parties can receive, because that both limits how much parties receives, but also impinges on the freedom of a corporate citizen or ordinary individuals who want to donate a specific amount to political parties, and I don't think that should be limited in any case. There's then the question of foreign funding. Now you have some countries in which they say you can't get money from foreign governments, but you could get money from foreign individuals or citizens. And, that doesn't make too much sense to me, because you could find other ways of getting that money in, either through local subsidiaries, and you can exercise influence that way. Or if you're a state, you can give the money to an individual and ask that individual to send the donation. So I think you can't say, we don't want foreign funding, we won't take it from a foreign government, but we'll take it from a foreign individual or foreign corporate. So it's either you have foreign funding, in which you must have disclosure so that you know who's trying to influence who, and that becomes a big question in international relations, or you don't at all, because that then completely protects your sovereignty absolutely. The problem with that, though, is that it does mean that you are curtailing possible sources of income. So I think you should allow foreign funding, but you should place firstly limits on it, and secondly have an absolute regime of disclosure, so that we know if particular country is giving this amount of money, or this particular corporate is giving this amount of money, we know what kind of influence they might be exercising over a governing party or other parties, for instance. So there's that option. Then on the question of actual disclosure, to what extent do you want disclosure? I think that's a tricky problem, because as I say, that would have the unintended consequences that sometimes we don't foresee. For one, dampening, putting a dampener on people wanting to give money to certain parties or to all of the parties. Some people would say, some corporates would say, because we want to support all the parties, we will also distribute proportionately, like the public formula, and we will disclose voluntarily. There are others who don't. The real problems is much less about disclosure, is when there's absolutely no disclosure. Then the kind of wheeling dealing that happens with parties and their investment vehicles or certain corporates becomes a big problem for corruption. So, for instance, if you think in the South African case, some people who got large deals, BEE or otherwise, are given some of these on the basis that some of the money finds its way back to political parties. Now, we don't know, and we can't provide any evidence of this because there's very little disclosure. But there are projects which are going on, both at places like IDASA, the Open Society Foundation, which runs a money and politics project, which are trying to look at instances, trying to do some research, and trying to make some concrete proposals around what should happen around party funding, both to limit corruption, but also to ensure that there's a sustainable space within which parties can operate and that they have the resources to do so.
You mentioned that party regulation funding can have unintended consequences, and you mentioned some of those. But how can it be prevented?
Well, like I'm saying, there's no way of absolutely preventing all of them. Look, any disclosure requirement is going to mean that people know who funds to who. And so if you want to exclusively fund an opposition party, you should know quite openly that you may risk raising the ire of the governing party. So that goes without saying. Should we not have disclosure on that basis? Well, we could think about whether you can have no disclosure but place caps on campaign spending. That may be an option. But there's no way of completely minimizing that, okay? There's also no way of minimizing if you say, in the absence of saying there will be no foreign funding whatsoever, and putting in some limits around disclosure, around the amounts you can receive from foreign governments, etc. No one is going to be able to minimize the influence that certain countries might have on your domestic policy, on your foreign policy, on all of those things. So you're never going to cut out all of this stuff. If you have too much disclosure on that, who knows whether the stuff will go underground, whether it will be driven by patronage networks and criminal networks, more importantly, who will then contribute some of their proceeds to a governing party. And what that has consequences for is not just corruption and criminality, but also a sense of impunity, which then starts permeating the whole of society. Because what they would do is they say, well, because we're donating to you, we expect some level of immunity from the criminal justice system. So it has this terrible knock-on effect, rising not just from impunity, but immunity from criminal prosecution, where it's driven through criminal networks and so forth. So, one has to be very careful how one does this. There's no silver bullet which is gonna solve all the problems. But there are 5 guiding principles, and if we play around how best we can maximize those guiding principles would create the most appropriate framework. Of course, going towards greater public funding, I think, will alleviate much of the need for trying to raise resources from too many private donors. That doesn't exclude the role of private donors, but private donors would then have to be discreet in buying into the bargain of some level of transparency, and re-looking at the formula of public funding to enable a chance for some of the smaller but more serious political parties to get access to better resources so that they're able to play their role.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.
That was political analyst Ebrahim Fakir speaking about political party funding.